those of you who are coming in that we will be recording this session. However, we will not be releasing the recordings until several of the sessions are already completed. Okay, so you won't don't expect the recordings to be released until possibly November, December at the earliest. All right, so let's get started. Welcome to our virtual Know Better, Do Better series. We are absolutely so thrilled to have so many of you joining us this morning from all over. We sincerely hope that you will really find this series very valuable as we all work to know more and do better to support proficient reading among all of our students. All right. And I am Sarah Lobaugh. I am a consultant at the intermediate unit for literacy and MTSS. And also, I'm going to let Amy introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Healy, and I am the Training and Consultation Supervisor at the Capital Area Intermediate Unit. And welcome. Glad to have you all here today.
Yep, we are super happy to be your presenters for this series. So let's get started. All right, so our sessions are going to address a common practice and explain why it's a problem of practice and provide some research that supports better practices for developing readers. So you can see on this screen the kind of progression we're going to go through in all of our sessions. Also at the bottom, you'll notice that there is a link, and we can put that in the chat, and that link will lead you to the slides today. Right. And Amy also says, make sure you go on Frontline and register. If you haven't, even if you're in a large group, if you could go to Frontline and register, that would be helpful in helping us make sure everybody gets credit for being here today. All right, so this is the first strategy in our Know Better, Do Better series. This is one you may be familiar with. It's called Guess the Covered Word. I know it's one that Amy and I both talked about because we used it when we started teaching. But then again, when we know better, we can do better. So a little bit about Guess the Covered Word. So Guess the Covered Word is a practice that has students make guesses about a word in a sentence that has been covered or blocked out or blocked out. So the teacher typically prompts the students to think about what word would make sense in the sentence. And this picture here on the screen actually shows an example of a Guess the Covered Word being used in a pretty well-known program. And when we see this in a program, we want to make sure that we kind of look at it skeptically and go, ooh, like we know better than to do that. And so what can we do to better help our students than this strategy? All right, so when we move to the next slide, here's an example of what Guess the Covered Word might look like. So typically there's a sentence that, again, has the word blocked out. So in this particular sentence, it says, I ate all the blank. And so then the next slide will show that the teacher reveals one letter, usually at a time, and prompts students to make a guess at what the word might be. So here we can make many guesses as to what the word might be in this sentence that would all make sense. We could say, I ate all the raspberries. I ate all the ranch dressing, because people do like ranch dressing. I ate all the ramen. I ate all the rice. I ate all the rigatoni, only to find out that the actual word is raisins. Okay, so there were lots of words that we could have fit in that sentence that start with an R that are foods. But some students might not even know what raisins are because they don't like raisins, or maybe they've never had raisins, right? So we've just encouraged students to guess at what that word was, and that's something that we don't want to do, right? So on the next slide, what's the problem with Guess the Covered Word? Well, first of all, here are a bunch of Guess the Covered Word activities that have been found in some reading programs, on Teachers Pay Teachers. There's been some that have been found in partner reading activities, you can see there, and even on social media. And yes, these are actually real examples that have been found recently. So it's still out there in some cases. Okay, and then the problem is that although the intended purpose of the strategy is to use context clues, it creates a lot of problems for novice and struggling readers. Here you can see some of the intended purposes that come from Guess the Covered Word lessons, but beware, because this activity does create some problems. Right, so the problem is, first, it takes students' attention away from the print and encourages them to guess and rely on context first, which isn't always going to be there, because context clues or context cues require background knowledge that some students don't have. Relying on context also slows down reading in order for students to make guesses. So it actually makes them slower at reading because they have to search for the known context to be able to figure out the word. Another problem is that relying on context, it gives the appearance of reading instead of actually using the skills that they need to decode the words. Another problem is that it teaches and encourages poor reading habits that are really hard to break, especially as they get older and the vocabulary becomes and the words become harder. So this is the strategy that struggling readers use. So you can find out some more about the problems that Guess the Covered Word creates by reading Dr. Kilpatrick's book. Down there at the bottom, you can see his name, Assessing and Preventing Reading Difficulties. And there's also a first grade teacher down here. Her name is Lindsay Kemeny. She is on Twitter, and she also has a really great blog. And she also talks about some of the problems that Guess the Covered Word makes for students who are novice or struggling readers. So now that we know that Guess the Covered Word is not really a helpful strategy for students, Amy is going to lead us through the research on that and how what we can do instead, and how we can help our readers.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So let's talk about the research and kind of break down some of the things that Sarah just talked about. We just went through what Guess the Covered Word is and what the problems are. So here's the research that supports that. And again, you see David Kilpatrick's name at the bottom. The book that Sarah mentioned, he does an excellent job of pulling all the research together. This isn't his research, but he pulled together hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies. So the first one is skilled word recognition does not require context. So in these hundreds of studies, they have demonstrated that skilled readers can actually read thousands of words instantly and without the use of context. So think about yourself as a proficient reader, right? You're reading words every day, words that you know. You don't rely on context to be able to figure out those words. They're already known to you. And then when you come to a word that you may not be familiar with, the first thing that we do as proficient readers is that we use our phonetic decoding skills to figure it out and break it down. And then we go to context to see, well, did that word even make sense that we're saying? So in other words, context is not required to recognize familiar words at all. The research also indicates that when we see a word, and this to me is really interesting, the areas in our brain that are responsible for the orthography and the phonology, they activate sooner than the areas that are responsible for the semantics. So in other words, the evidence is suggesting that readers recognize the spelling and the pronunciation before meaning. Isn't that, I think that's really an interesting brain-based fact. Skilled readers can also identify unfamiliar words accurately by sounding them out. And this is even true for irregular words. When you're a proficient reader, you don't need to rely on the context like we're saying. You have the skills to be able to figure them out. Poor readers, the third one down, poor readers, not skilled readers, rely heavily on the context. So poor readers are the ones that they don't have that familiar word pool. They have weaker decoding skills. So they have to compensate when they read. And in doing so, they rely more on the context. So when we have students come to a word that they don't know and we encourage them to guess, we're actually giving them strategies that poor readers do. And we want to avoid doing that. So activities like guess the cover word is actually supporting the strategies that struggling readers do instead of what good readers do. And the fourth one down there, contextual guessing does not promote sight word learning in poor readers. So some research has actually found that contextual guessing actually hinders word learning. So in other words, when a student would come to a word that they don't know, and if they're encouraged to guess, they're not building that familiar word bank that's necessary for reading. Poor readers, they don't notice when they come to a word and they're making a guess. They don't notice those internal letter sequences. And those things are going to help them later on when those words become familiar words to them. And then the last one there is semantic errors are not a sign of better reading development than phonetic errors. So in some philosophies and in some even programs, they'll say when students come to a word that they don't know, and if they're making a semantic error, that's a good thing. In reality, that's not a good thing. A phonetic error is better. So what this would look like is if a student was reading a sentence and the word was horse, and they said pony. Okay, you might say, oh, well, at least it made sense, right? That's a semantic error. But they didn't use any of their decoding skills, not even to do the first letter. So it's actually a sign that they don't have the decoding skills and they're relying on context, which we're showing is not an efficient way for reading. So context isn't necessarily bad, though. We don't want to say don't ever use context. So there are two times when we're using context. And the first time is the one we've been focusing on here, which we don't want to use it as our first line of defense in figuring out a word. And that's using context for word identification. So in the sentence that you see, the grocery store mailed the weekly blank to their customers. If a student didn't know that word, or they were doing an activity like guess the covered word, they may come up with several things to go in that blank, right? They might say they mailed the weekly flyer, the weekly advertisement, coupons, samples. It could be many different things to put in there. Even when students might guess the word correctly, and they rely on context to figure that out, and they got the word right, they're actually compensating for those inaccurate or non-automatic word reading because they don't know that word to figure it out. And what's happening is they're draining comprehension. Versus if they were able to attack that word and figure out that word, then they're not going to put as much of a strain on their comprehension. Where this starts to really show, and I know we have 4th grade, 5th grade, middle school, even high school teachers out there with us today, where this really starts to show is in those upper grades. So a student in K-3 can often get by with making these guesses, and you might not even realize that they don't have the decoding skills. But what happens when the text becomes more challenging and there's no pictures and the vocabulary is more sophisticated and we have complex sentences, right? All of that starts to fall and they then begin to struggle, and we hit this wall usually around 4th and 5th grade for those students that suddenly they're not able to read, that they're really struggling. All right, so context for word identification, not as our first line of defense. Context, though, is a good thing for comprehension. So let's say that same sentence, the grocery store mailed the weekly circular to their customers. Where you can use context for comprehension is they have to know how to read the words first. So they would know all the words in the sentence, but maybe they don't know the meaning. So we see the word circular, they could read it, but they might not know what that means. Maybe they only know because it's a multiple meaning word. Maybe they only know a circle and they're confused. Like, why would the grocery store mail circles home to people? Like, why does that make sense? So they can start using context to try to figure out what the word means, but they have to know the word. And what's going to come with that is direct instruction in vocabulary. So one of the better practices that we just mentioned is don't use guess the covered word for word identification or any type of guessing strategy activity for word identification. But it's okay to use it in comprehension situations. Instead, what we want to do is explicitly teach decoding skills and using a logical scope and sequence to do that. Many programs, many of your curriculum already have that in place. And if not, that's something that Sarah and I could kind of support your schools, your districts with looking at to make sure you have something. The second one is once we're teaching those decoding skills, we want to practice those skills and use decodable text to practice that. And decodable text, we're not living in that all the time. Decodable text is used to reinforce those skills that we're taught. And it can be used at all grade levels, including in secondary. But again, we're not living in that all of the time. And then when students come to words that they don't know or they're stuck on, we want to prompt them with the correct prompts. We don't want to prompt them to make guesses. We want to prompt them to first look through the entire word, sound out the word, use our decoding skills, blend those sounds fast together, and then look at the last step. The last step then is to check it. Does that make sense? That's where we put the context application in. So we follow this type of a procedure. So we have some resources to share that go along with what we've been talking about this morning. The first one is Dr. Pam Kastner has put together a Wakelet filled with decoding prompts and bookmarks. So I'm going to open this up and show you. And Sarah, tell me if it's good to see. Yes, awesome. Okay. So in her Wakelet, there are several decoding prompts and bookmarks of what we could say instead of looking at, well, guess that word or skip that word or get your mouth ready and all of those like Beanie Baby strategies, we call them. These are things that we would want to say instead. So she's created a bookmark herself, a point to the word, sound the word out, say the word, and then at the end, think about it. Did that make sense? There's other ones on here that she has collected from other people that are all very similar. Keep your eyes on the word, look through the word, read the sounds, read the word fast. And again, at the end, reread the sentence. Did that make sense? So this is something that you could use to make sure that you're prompting correctly. Like I said, a lot of different bookmarks and prompts in here across all grade levels. And as you go down through the Wakelet, there's ones that are even for upper grades that are focusing more at the syllable stage here. So that's a resource for you. Let me go back here a second. The next one is from the Florida Center for Reading Research, and they have instructional routines that we have it linked to. And once you get to this site, if you scroll down, there are right around here, decode words and connected text, decode and write words. You can click on these, and they say kindergarten and first grade, but these can actually be used even higher than that. When you open those up, you have several instructional routines that have been put together to kind of help a teacher of what script they could say to help students when they're decoding words in context. So this is another really good resource that you could use instead. Okay. The next one is also from the Florida Center for Reading Research. And hold on a second, I just lost my presentation. Go. And these are their student center activities. And I'm sure these are familiar to a lot of people, but I'm always amazed like how many people that this is the first time they've ever seen these. So I just have to share, because there is so much out there on the internet, and teachers pay teachers and other places that people can download things that you don't know if they are research-based and what has been put together. You know, you're relying on what somebody else has out there. Everything in Florida Center for Reading Research is based on research. And so I highly, highly, highly suggest that you would go here before you would go and pay for something off the internet or download something from someone who you don't know that background. And so you can go to the Florida Center for Reading Research, fcrr.org. Their Florida Center activities, and there's lots of different grade levels. And again, even those in middle school, high school have used the 4th and 5th grade, but it gives you an idea of where to start. So if I go just to the kindergarten and first grade ones, you can see they have broken down from phonological awareness, phonics, there's fluency, vocabulary, comprehension. So you can go to the areas that you're working on in your literacy instruction. For this case, we're thinking about decoding. So we can go and look at what are those skills that we're working on, and we can support with some center activity or some small group activities. So I might go to the encoding and decoding section and pull up some of these lessons. And so when you click on these, they'll give you exactly what the lesson is and what materials and what to do and what you need for everything right there. So it's an awesome resource if you've never used that. And there's tons in here. All right, and the last resource that I want to share is from the University of Florida Literacy Institute, otherwise known as UFLI. And UFLI is building and building more and more all the time. They just had a new program that came out that's really good for early phonics. So if you go to resources, you can look, they have a word work map for beginners, one from intermediate, and a blending board. So I'm just going to click on the intermediate one and kind of show you, because they're all very similar. And here's something that you could use when you're working on, hey, I'm working on vowel teams, and I can have students building words on here and moving just like that. So just another really good resource that's out there, different activities that you can have them do. Okay, so as we're wrapping up in these last couple minutes here today, want to take a look at what's to come in the next session. So each of these sessions, we're going to focus on a different classroom common practice that, and like we did today, you know, what is it and what's the problem with it? And what's the research actually say? So today we talked about guess the covered word. And hopefully we have convinced you that if this is an activity that you've been using, that maybe there's some other things that you could do instead. And think about, like, when we're prompting students to not have context as our first line of defense, that we can prompt them to look through the word and use their decoding skills first. The next time that we come together in 2 weeks, we're going to take a look at word boxes, sometimes known as word coffins, and rainbow words and rainbow word writing, and then other types of spelling activities like that that are often seen. And what does the research say about those things? So I want to thank you for joining us this morning, and just always remember that, you know, as teachers, we're doing the best that we can, right? You do the best that you can until you know better. And then when you know better, then you do better. So we hope that you take something away from today. And in the words of Maya Angelou, that when you know better, that you do better. The link to this presentation is again on the bottom of the screen. And you can link from the presentation to the sites that I just shared with you, or any of them. You can also type in Google them and they'll pop right up. When we share out the presentation later on in a few couple months or so, we'll be able to share those links if you weren't able to get them, or contact us directly and we can share those things as well.
And before you log off, I put the link in the chat. So if you want to grab it out
Awesome.
of that or
Thank
write
you
it on
so
the
much.
board if you're in a big room, it's there for you.
Awesome. So thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you back with us in a couple weeks. Tell your other colleagues, and registration will reopen later on today so we can have even more people join us. Thank you.
Thank you,
Have
everyone.
a good day, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
See you guys.
See ya.
Thanks for coming, Dan. Oh, he's gone already.
Hi, sorry, my video is not coming on, but I did have a question while I had you guys on here. I was trying to fool with it and I couldn't get it. So currently our district is using the maze